a lot of people influenced me, for better or for worse, during the course of my career as well, I was never really a scholar, but I thought I wanted to be one, diplomat practitioner. The two best negotiators that I've ever had the privilege of working with, scholarship and analysis notwithstanding, are Dan Kurtzer, whose capacity to structure the elements in a negotiation and understand the complexities of what is required to actually carry one out are virtually unparalleled and unrivaled. And of course, one of the most effective secretaries of state, perhaps one of the most consequential, James Baker. The two of them, and they worked together for a time, really understood what it means to structure a deal and to close one. And it's, for many years, I've known Dan and been his partner at times. We've argued quite a bit about matters, but it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. For those of you who have, for those of you who may or may not have heard bits and pieces of what I'm about to say in other fora today, I apologize. I want to start with a number of personal remarks so there'll be no misunderstanding about where I stand on matters. I'm not running for anything. I'm associated with no campaign. I don't want to be associated with a campaign. I had my 25 years working for Republican and Democratic administrations. My latest trope is that there ought to be term limits imposed on former advisors to secretaries of state and presidents, particularly when their advice was not well measured and not terribly on the mark. And I would argue that for too long, during too much of the time working on the Arab-Israeli negotiations, the advice that we provided to secretaries and presidents was not terribly on the mark, myself included. This detachment affords me a certain measure of honesty and clarity, which I think is extremely important in life as well as in diplomacy. People are not honest with one another. A technical glitch. Oh, so this is not being heard yet.
I do my dancing bear routine. Well, because I'm shorter than you. The perfect diplomat should be 5'9".
Okay. Does this work? Does everybody hear me? Excellent. I have to move on very quickly. I was talking about honesty and clarity, which I think are two qualities that are absent from human relationships, friendships, business propositions, marriages. They're also absent, by and large, from diplomacy. I have the luxury these days, since I'm not responsible for anything, and I'm writing books and giving talks, to try to be honest and clear. And that's what I want to do today. I'm going to turn 60 soon, and I have determined that the most compelling ideology in life is not nationalism, it's not capitalism, it's not democracy. It's success. Because success generates real power and real constituents. And failure generates the opposite. And frankly, if I looked at the last 16 years of American policies toward the Middle East, I would argue that we have not been succeeding. We've been failing. We failed for 8 years under Bill Clinton, despite the best of intentions about how to make peace. And we failed galactically for the last 8 years under George W. Bush about how to make war. And the truth is, for a great power, if you cannot assist capably and effectively in peacemaking, and you stumble badly in how to deal with preemptive or preventative military action or containment. And the truth is, what kind of great power are you really? Are we a great power? Particularly in this particular part of the world. I think it's critically important that we get this right, regardless of who becomes president, and whether it's a Republican or a Democratic morning that dawns on January 20th, again, for the next president. It's critically important because as a consequence of our failings, we are neither feared, admired, nor respected, in my judgment, in an area of the world that is increasingly critical and central to our national security. The organizing principle of a nation's foreign policy is how to protect your homeland. If you can't protect your homeland, frankly, you don't need a foreign policy. And I belong to those who would argue that the primary threat to American national interests will not come from an ascendant China. It will not come from a former Soviet Union seeking to regain its previous glories. It will not come from an economically powerful Europe. All of these represent foreign policy challenges. Primary threat to our national security interests and those of our friends will come from a divided, angry, dysfunctional, conflict-ridden Middle East and Arab and Muslim world. And the real question is, what can we do about it? We are, in a way, in an investment trap. We can't fix this part of the world, in my judgment, and we can't extricate ourselves from it. So I would argue that before we start recommending policies and talking about what I call the hardware of American policy, what we're actually going to do, that we ought to first spend some time discussing the software, what we think about this region and how we think about it. So I'm going to make a number of observations on the source of our failings. Now, all of this is arguable and debatable, and we can argue and debate it. It's my take, based on a quarter of a century of interacting in a system with all of its flaws and imperfections, and my own personal observations, complete with my prejudices and predispositions. So why are we failing? We're failing in part because we confront problems that do not have quick or easy solutions. We are problem solvers by nature, and I'll get to this in a minute, and it's very hard for us to accept the fact that we cannot, as Niebuhr once wrote, manage history. I would argue that that should have been a self-evident proposition based on our observations of the other imperial powers or informal empires that tried to digest this region and impose their will. The Middle East is littered with the remains of great powers who believed wrongly they could impose their will, their ambitions, and their schemes and dreams on small tribes. And the reality is, for a variety of reasons, they can't. But we face, from Iran to Iraq to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to democratization and political and economic change in this region, by definition, structural problems over which America has very little to say or do. We can make them worse, or perhaps we can ameliorate them, depending on our behavior, but we cannot fix them. The notion that we can fix these problems seems to me is extremely costly and extremely naive. I believed in this when it comes to the Arab-Israeli issue for a very long time, and I'm terrified about actually giving it up, this notion. But I'm on the verge of fundamentally questioning whether or not we can even address this one in the way it needs to address. Two examples will suffice. What I call the Palestinian Humpty Dumpty. The Palestinian national movement, 50 years on, is in the midst of its most fundamental crisis. It is fallen, it is broken, it is divided into at least two parts. It has neither a monopoly on the forces of violence within its own society or on a unified negotiating position. That will be absolutely critical when and if it faces the Israelis in serious and sustained negotiations with a mediator or without, in order to resolve the core issues that drive the conflict: Jerusalem, borders, refugees, and security. Or Iran, which is in the midst still of political economic changes which flowed from a revolution that is not yet complete. And yet our policies depend, and the interests of our friends, on how these two transformative processes play themselves out. And yet I'm not sure we are in a position to address these problems. I'm almost certain that we're not in the fundamental sense. Second, we really don't have as much influence as we have persuaded ourselves that we have. We, it seems to me, and I'm a historian by training, have moments of influence where we have acted effectively, facilitated brokered agreements, projected our military force and power, but it's wrong to talk about America as some sort of hegemonic power in this region, as if we somehow have been able to control the pace and flow of events since the end of the Second World War, when the last great power, for any number of reasons, abdicated its responsibilities and had to pull back from a region that it had considered its primary area of interest. We're like, I would argue, and I have a chapter in my book called Gulliver's Troubles, which is borrowed from Stanley Hoffman's notion of Gulliver's Troubles in the Atlantic system. We have Gulliver's Troubles in this region. We are like some modern-day Gulliver wandering around, all tied up in knots as a consequence of our own misperceptions in the region, and tied up again by small powers whose agendas are existential and who are determined, essentially, to carry out their own interests regardless of what it is we want and what it is we're going to do. And as I mentioned before, this investment trap is very much on my mind. We have to be in this region, but we can't fix it, and we're not operating there very effectively. Part of the problem with respect to our lack of influence flows from where we are and who we are. If you want to understand, in my judgment, why America behaves abroad the way we behave abroad, think about where we are. We have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, and fish to our east and west. I submit to you, no other great power in the history of the world, no other great power had such physical security. None. Not the Brits, not the Japanese, certainly not the Ottomans, not the Romans, not the Russians. We alone have achieved this unrivaled and unprecedented physical security, and it really does influence the way we think of the world. It makes us incredibly idealistic about what motivates other people. It makes us incredibly practical in thinking, given our optimism. And our political system reinforces this notion, because we're the first political system in the world to be based on an idea, which is that the individual counts in life. The primacy of the individual. Nobody talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the 18th century. Only Americans talked about it. The notion that individuals can transform their own lives and affect the world around them is deeply ingrained in who we are. And it's deeply ingrained in the way we approach the world. It also accounts for our physical security and our abundance and our exceptionalism, for our arrogance. When we think we know, when we won't listen, and when we get addicted to the notion that we act with altruistic purpose alone, or believe the rest of the world believes that we do. 0.5% of the 300 million of us are now in a volunteer army. We're not a great power, an imperial power. The Brits alone, during 300 years of their history, exported 30 million of their own citizens to staff their empire. I don't see people lining up to join the military. I don't see them lining up at... My son graduated from Princeton with a degree in astrophysics. He went on to go to Cairo to study Arabic. He was propelled to, have adventures in the world, but I don't see people lining up to learn funny languages and to go staff an empire in an effort to transform the world. That's not who we are. We're not nearly prepared to take on the kinds of responsibilities that our ideology often imposes on us, or we impose on ourselves. And second, we see the world not the way it is. We see the world the way we want it to be. I remember dealing with Arabs and Israelis all those years. I really thought I had them all figured out. But the truth is, I don't think we do. We do not know what it's like to live on the knife's edge. We do not know what it's like to struggle for political and physical identity. Certainly not my generation. This notion that we somehow apply our own historical lessons or don't look at history, and A.J.P. Taylor may have had it right, that the only lesson of history is that there are no lessons. But history can be a very cruel and unforgiving teacher if, in fact, you don't take it seriously. What made us think, in looking at Iraq in 2001 and 2002, that we could project the kind of force that we projected and get away with it? If I were to ask you how many Americans were killed during the entire American occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1952, 7 years we occupied Japan. Do you know how many Americans were killed in hostile actions by Japanese during 7 years? None. Not one. Not one American. And a handful during our occupation of Germany. What made us believe, somehow, that we could do what we wanted to do in Iraq? Why? It was more than just bad policy. It represents, to some degree, how we look at the rest of the world and how we look at ourselves. The third source of our failing is the nature of our political system and the way it's structured. I measured my life for a quarter of a century in terms of administrations, 4 and 8 year increments. That's not how the rest of the world, or at least the world I followed, measures time. Time is measured in the long run, the long play. It's a generational proposition. Now, I'm not sure we're capable of creating policies that last a generation, but we're going to have to adjust our clock if, in fact, we really do want to be more effective in our Middle East policies. And then there's the issue of our domestic politics. I'll say more about this in a minute, but I would only say it is in the nature of our system that lobbies lobby. That is not the issue. However imperfect the system is, that's the rules of the game. But that's not the issue. The question is not whether lobbies lobby. The question is, do presidents lead? That's the question. And can presidents articulate policies toward this region that in fact serve the national interest and summon the domestic constituents and constituencies in order to support those policies? I would argue that when a willful president in fact articulates a fundamentally effective policies, domestic lobbies usually come along, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes not always without a fight. But we can restore the balance, and we need to. The limitations of our influence, I would argue, are also felt with respect to who we talk to and who we don't. We are now dealing with 4 regional actors, 2 states, Syria and Iran, and 2 non-states, Hamas and Hezbollah, who have uniquely positioned themselves to affect what we do in this region and what we don't. We can't break them, and we can't buy them. They are permanent fixtures of the political landscape in this region. I'm not suggesting, because I wouldn't, that it's imperative that we engage them for the sake of engagement. We do need a strategy, but we have to figure out what it is we're going to do with them. Iran sits at the nexus of everything that we care about in this region. Nuclear proliferation, Iraq, the Arab-Israeli issue, and Lebanon, and even the war against terror. And yet we do not have a policy. We don't. This will be perhaps one of the most fundamental challenges to the next administration. And the relationships that we do have are special relationships with the Israelis and the Saudis. And they're interesting relationships. They both developed roughly around the same time, during the 1940s. They both served American interests on occasion, but they have both become, to some degree, dysfunctional relationships. They don't work the way they were supposed to work. And to some degree, they've gotten out of control. And we need to essentially figure out what we're going to do about the people we don't talk to, and perhaps start talking in a different way to the people that we do talk to. Because the stakes are increasingly complex and higher than ever before. Just some offhand advice in the next few minutes, because I want to leave enough time for questions and answers. First of all, it's a big region. I'm not sure that it's a region that lends itself to an all-encompassing strategy, certainly one that's made emblematic by a slogan or two. It's not that things in the Middle East aren't connected. They are connected. The question is whether or not a single matrix works, in effect, to create the kind of flexibility and responsiveness that we need, and I don't think it does. Second, we need to look to the long play, not the quick fix and the easy solution, because there aren't any. All of the problems, the 4 core challenges that we face right now in this region, extricating ourselves from Iraq, finding a way to deal with Iran, dealing with the Arab-Israeli issue and finding out whether or not there are negotiations that can succeed, and what do you do with the ones that need to be managed over time? What do we do with our freedom agenda, our so-called freedom agenda, democratization? How do we create a balance between encouraging political and economic reform on one hand, without trying to export American exceptionalism to countries that resent it, don't want it, and may not even be amenable to it? And finally, how do we deal with the most difficult prospect of avoiding another, this time, catastrophic attack, unconventional attack on the United States? These are the core issues that we face. This is the agenda for the next administration. None of them have fixes that will be quick or easy. With respect to investing in the Middle East, however, I would borrow a phrase, and I've used this line here before, from Larry Summers, who said a lot, former president of Harvard, who said a lot of very controversial things, but one thing he said that was unmistakable. He said, in the history of the world, no one ever washed a rental car. And what Summers meant by that is extremely important. There's enormous wisdom in that. I mean, simply put, you don't care about something unless you own it. And an American administration will need to invest, pick its spots wisely, but invest in the things that it cares about. Because if it doesn't invest, if the President of the United States is not prepared to make Arab-Israeli peace, trying to figure out a way to contain, co-opt, open up a new chapter in the U.S.-Iranian relationship, any of the issues we confront, it will become apparent very quickly, and people here at home and those in the region will see it all too quickly. And that extends, I might add, to finding the right person to become the next Secretary of State. Now, I worked for 6 of them, and I won't rank them or judge them, but I will only say this, and you can draw your own conclusions. To be an effective Secretary of State and to deal with this area of the world, you need 3 things. You need to have a relationship with the President of the United States, a close relationship. So the President will watch your back in Washington and also make it unmistakably clear to those in the region that he or she is my designated representative. They speak for me. That's element number 1. Number 2, you need someone who knows how to negotiate. I don't care if it's a lawyer, a doctor, a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker. It doesn't matter. This person needs to have some experience with what it means to actually identify the elements to close the negotiation. What do you want? What do I want? What does he want? And to figure out a way, honestly and clearly, to close a deal. And finally, you really need somebody extremely tough. I had tremendous, and still do, have tremendous respect for Bill Clinton. No one cared about the Arab-Israeli issue more than he. No one tried to do more during 7 years. The chapter in my book on Clinton is called Mr. Nice Guy. Bill Clinton and the Arabs and Israelis he loved too much. This is not about that. You've got to be tough with Arabs and Israelis. You've got to maintain a certain amount of detachment and tactical and strategic responsiveness. And you cannot become part of the political furniture. You can't become part of the furniture at all. You have to husband your resources so that you are not taken for granted by Arabs and Israelis who have seen presidents and secretaries of state and special envoys come and go. I'm not sure, frankly, I could identify right now anyone who is viable and current in American politics who reflects right now the kind of personality and persona that we need. Let me close with one comment about Israel and then close. We have a special relationship with the State of Israel. It's based on value affinity, which mixes seamlessly with a pro-Israeli community and constituency that has made, backed up now by millions of evangelicals, a very compelling case for any number of reasons. I've been a proponent of this relationship because I do believe identification with societies that share our values are important. I've been a proponent of this relationship because I believe in the paradox of the partial mediator. The reason America's phone rings on the Arab-Israeli issue is because of our special relationship with Israel, not despite it. If we lacked the trust and confidence of the Israelis, nobody would be calling us. Nobody would be calling us. But we have allowed this special relationship, which is extremely important for our values and for our diplomacy, to become exclusive. And that exclusivity, under both 8 years of Bill Clinton and 8 years of George W. Bush, in my judgment, has undermined and hurt American interests at times, and at the risk of being presumptuous, it has not been good for the Israelis. There's very little reciprocity in this relationship. There's not a whole lot of honesty. Dan may or may not agree. In 25 years of working on this issue, I do not recall one occasion where we had an honest conversation with the Prime Minister of Israel on the issue of settlement activity. Its inception, why it's being done, what the costs were, what the risks. what the consequences were. And this is not one-hand clapping. There are any number of behaviors on the part of Arab states and Palestinians which we draw attention to. But unless we're prepared to understand that American interests are being harmed if the exclusivity of this relationship takes precedence, I'm not sure we're going to be able to operate as effectively as we need to be. It does not mean sacrificing Israeli interests on the altar of some sort of American instrumentalism. I mean, I sold this book from one end of the country to the other, talking to Jewish groups and non-Jewish groups, and the notion that somehow we have anything to be embarrassed or defensive about when it comes to the consistency of America's support for Israel, something I don't understand. I really don't understand it. We have stood by the Israelis. We have given them extraordinary latitude. We've allowed them to shape the tactics and strategies of our policies with respect to the Arab-Israeli peace process. We've respected the existential struggles and problems that they face. There's no question about that. But there's got to be a balance. I have a notion in my book, and I don't mean to trivialize it, called the cosmic oy vey. Cosmic oy vey is the inability on the part of many American Jews to distinguish between what is important and what is not. Everything is raised to a level of existential angst, and it's bad. Jimmy Carter writes a book. It's not a great book, and the sky is falling. Professors Walton and Mearsheimer take on, in my judgment, I'm not sure they succeeded, because they didn't talk to anybody, but they took on the issue of the pro-Israeli lobby, and the sky is falling. This is not right. It's not right. So we need to try to restore, the next president needs to try to restore the balance between what it means to have a special relationship with a very close ally and what it means to allow that relationship to essentially get out of balance with great detriment to American national interests, in my view. And I say this as a member of this community, that is to say, the Jewish community. I'll conclude with one final observation. The first and last president that ever had an impact on me was Jack Kennedy. I was 12 when he was murdered. Kennedy said something about himself which is really telling, and if you take nothing else away from here today, take this away, because I think that America needs to approach the rest of the world with these three words. Kennedy talked about himself as an idealist without illusion. That's where we need to be. It really is where we need to be. American exceptionalism stops at the water's edge. America's not for everyone. American values can't be exported on the back of a tank or with a freedom agenda. That's not idealism. That's just stupidity. But the world can be affected, and we have a positive contribution to make, a very consequential contribution in my judgment. If we pick our spots right, if we understand our strengths, if we recognize our limitations, and above all, if we go through the process of changing the world with our eyes open.
Okay, why don't we do 4 or 5 questions, and then Aaron will answer, and we'll see if we get a second round in. Right here first. Yes. Maybe identify yourself so we know who you are.
First of all,
Let's try to do the question part. Okay.
The question really is that, considering a number of factors, okay, even if we would have a solution on paper, that's not possible reasonable because about 40% of the officers are from the West Bank today. So essentially what I'm trying to say, there's no solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem today, okay? I think there is any. It's like a condition with no solution.
Okay.
Solution. And
Okay.
that being the fact, as I think it is, what should the U.S. do?
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Oh, you. Yeah.
My question is about the comments you made about Walton and UChannel's work. I'm wondering, you said that they may not have succeeded. I'm wondering what aspects you think they did succeed in bringing to light in their book, and what did they not succeed in? Because you say that the exclusivity of the relationship might pose a problem for the United States. So, what extent do you think that the argument they make is right until it's
Okay. Yes.
You talked a lot about leadership and the role of either in state, the Secretary of State or the President. And the question I have goes to whether there's a role for Congress. And the reason for that is we saw that in the Vietnam War we had J. William Fulbright in the Foreign Relations Committee and going over issues. We saw the congressional hearing concerning the Pentagon Papers. We saw material after the First Gulf War. So I wonder, in your position, is there a role for Congress in trying to establish not policy, but at least realigning the debate that's occurring between the various groups that you see?
Okay. No, next to you. Yeah.
Typically, when people think about the negotiations that are ongoing, they normally mention on the Palestinian side that there's no consolidation of power because of foreign attack. But yet also on the Israeli side, I mean, obviously, because of the tremendous number of small parties, you often find that within negotiations, because the nature of forming a coalition, special interests are often overrepresented. So how do you see the United States maybe being able to work on both sides to try to consolidate power and facilitate the negotiations?
Okay. All right.
To what degree do you think that Middle East oil has shaped or influenced American foreign policy, and what do you see as the future for that issue?
These are very good questions. They're all impossible to answer quickly, but I will try to make some relevant comments about each of them. I agree with you. I do not believe, and I choose my words very carefully here, that there is a conflict-ending solution right now to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All right? By conflict ending, I mean all claims are adjudicated and finalized, all irredenta are abandoned, and respective leaders from both constituencies who are empowered stand up and say the conflict is over. There is no such solution to this conflict today. And I'm not presumptuous enough to suggest whether or not there will ever be one. In the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it means managing and creating a process, which is only another way to describe a conflict that we can't resolve today. If I were recommending a policy toward the Secretary of State, it would be to invest very heavily in an Israeli-Syrian negotiation. I find myself hard-pressed to say it because during the Clinton years I was opposed to it. We negotiated. We didn't look at the negotiation in the right way. We sacrificed opportunities in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations as a consequence. But it's unmistakable to me right now that given divisions within Israel, given the galactic natures of the issues that have not yet been closed, borders, security, territory, Jerusalem, and refugees, and given the crisis which now exists within the Palestinian national movement, which cannot be solved by America, the chances of getting an empowered Israeli negotiator who can deliver his or her constituency, an empowered Palestinian president who has two things: a monopoly over the forces of violence, one gun, one authority, one law, and a single negotiating position out of the dynamic that now rules relations between Hamas and Fatah is virtually out of the question. That process, if we can do it, needs to be managed. If the Palestinians want to try to reconcile, don't get in the way. Don't participate in a boycott and sanctions against Gaza. Work on opening up and improving security in the West Bank and removing checkpoints. Encourage negotiations between empowered Israeli and Palestinian leaders. Don't go for broke because you won't succeed, and don't abandon it, as George W. Bush did for most of his first and much of his second term. That's about the best you are going to be able to do on the Israeli-Palestinian track. If you want to look for an opportunity, go north. It's 2 states. It's 4 issues: withdrawal, water, security, normalization. It could provide a key over time to reorienting and protecting American interests and posing choices for groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and even the Iranians. It makes the most sense. But if you go into this negotiation, do not go into it with any illusions. It will cost, big time. It will cost the government of Israel 100% of the Golan Heights. Not 99.9% minus 300 yards off the northeastern portion of the lake, but the whole thing. Just like Sadat got. Just like Sadat got. But don't let Assad, this time Assad Jr., off the hook by creating an indirect process which is cold and somehow wants to turn Israeli-Syrian peacemaking into a glorified non-belligerency agreement. The Israelis are asked to give 100%, and they will be, and the Syrians have to give 100% in terms of their own conviction and demonstrated capacity to deliver a sense of confidence that this is more, will be more than just a glorified non-belligerency agreement. And finally, don't ask for too much when it comes to Iran. Do not expect the Syrians to sever what is a 30-year strategic relationship with the Iranians. If the Israeli-Syrian process works, backed up by the Europeans, on hundreds of millions of dollars and economic cooperation, the Syrians will see their own interests and will do what they need to do with respect to the Iranians. Walton Mearsheimer, I've talked with them on national television and on NPR. I commend them for putting the issue of domestic politics, which Tony Lake said is like sex to the Victorians. It's on everybody's mind, but nobody wants to talk about it. I commend them for putting the issue on the table, but I think both in terms of their methodology and their conclusions, they ran off the highway. And, I did 160 interviews for this book. I talked to every American president, with the exception of Bill Clinton, Jerry Ford, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, all 9 secretaries of state, all the key evangelicals, Falwell, Robertson, John Hagee, Ralph Reed, key members of the American Jewish community, key members of Congress, senators, congressmen, staff aide, key members of the Arab American community, to ask them the question, how does domestic politics shape American policy with respect to the Arab-Israeli issue? And I spent 25 years in a system observing it, with all my personal baggage and blinders, admittedly. And the conclusion I've come to is a much different one. Domestic politics has a powerful voice, but not, I repeat, not a veto. And I try to show in the book how when presidents led, Nixon and Kissinger, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker, when they led and they articulated an American national interest in the pursuit of Arab-Israeli peace, domestic lobbies, including Congress, followed noisily, angrily, sometimes after messy fights, but in the end, leadership prevailed. It is as it should be, and as it must be. I no more want the Department of State articulating policy as I would want AIPAC or the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's a consensual process in an arena. When you have an effective American Secretary of State and a president who is prepared to lead and has the wisdom and focus, and we have had some, the system really does work. You fight your battles, You choose your allies and your adversaries, and you make the policy work. It's not some sort of foreordained process. And I think they've missed it. They've missed it. Value affinity and domestic politics seamlessly interacts. It is in the nature of our political system. It is not always, as they point out, beneficial to the national interest. But it takes leadership to make it beneficial. And yes, someone today in one of my earlier talks said that I put too much faith in stock in leadership, that my analysis and argument is reductionist, that it's much more complicated than this. And I grant all that. But one thing I know, there is one thing standing in front of the cruel and impersonal forces of history that seek to bury human initiative and progress and development. And it's only one thing. On the absurd level, it's me and you. On the national level, it's men and women who are prepared to be pragmatic and visionary at the same time, and who can lead. So I do believe in leadership. And on this one, I think Walter Mearsheimer had it wrong. Congress. At the risk of just contradicting myself, I will say that Congress as a forum to debate Arab-Israeli issues in the current structure that we have created is, frankly, a lost cause. I interviewed Chuck Hagel, a man I admire and respect greatly, who said to me, Aaron, he said, if I wanted a safe business, I would have gone and sold shoes. I am not, he said, the U.S. Senator from the state of Israel. I'm from the Midwest. Congress, he went on, Congress is not a body that is going to demonstrate heroic leadership on this question. They're not. They really aren't. So I think Congress, and again, when you see what happens when you put Congress against a willful president who is determined to have his way, you see what happens. 2006 elections were a classic example of that fact. The country voted. We had a new mandate. The war in Iraq was going to somehow be completely readjusted because the people had spoken. Well, the people spoke, and the willful president acted. And now we're better off, to some degree. But both Obama and McCain, however different they may be on this issue, both of their policies now fall under one rubric: how to leave without losing. We can argue all day long about the differences between these two, but in the end, that is what unites them together: how to leave Iraq without losing. So I don't think Congress is ever going to be the kind of forum to debate these issues, because there's very little debate. And Walton Mearsheimer, on this one, it seems to me, even without talking to any senators or congressmen, probably have it more right than wrong. I mean, when you talk to U.S. senators and congressmen, here's what they'll say. They'll say, look, most of us really don't care about Israel. I'm a senator from Iowa. I'm in Washington. What do I care about? Here's what I care about. I care about ethanol. I care about the family farm. I care about inheritance taxes. I don't care about Israel. A very important organization comes to me and says, will you sign this letter? And one of my colleagues says, look, Israel's our friend, particularly in the post-9/11 environment. You don't need the headache. You don't need the exposure. You don't need the headache. It's all done in a very, at least initially, in a very soft, indirect way. So you've got the majority of senators and congressmen, frankly, who aren't passionately pro-Israel, and a minority who are very pro-Israel. And not just, I might add, because they come from states where their constituents are urging them to be pro-Israel. I mentioned this some years ago, I got an argument with Carl Levin, who I interviewed. He said, look, stop all this business with AIPAC. Go talk to some of my colleagues who have no Jewish constituents and ask them why they support Israel. And I said, who do you have in mind? He said, why don't you go talk to John Lewis from Georgia and Dan Inouye from Hawaii. So I did. It's extraordinary when you hear their stories. And this is why Walter Mearsheimer, in some respects, don't get it, because they never bothered to talk to anybody. You talk to Dan Inouye, and here's the stock story he tells. He wakes up at an amputee ward somewhere in Europe, 1944-45, with no arm. He's sitting, his bed is next to a young kid, about his age, a fellow amputee, and they start to talk. This is Inouye telling me the story. And the young kid is telling Inouye about a place in Germany and in Poland where the bodies are stacked like cordwood. And Inouye says, well, all these people were murdered. Why were they murdered? Were they criminals? I mean, why were they murdered? And the kid says, well, they murdered because they were Jews. Inouye looks at me and says, right then and there, he said, I wanted to be bar mitzvahed. This is his reaction. All right? How many Jews do you think there are in Dan Inouye's constituency? John Lewis, with tears in his eyes, talks to me about how his Jewish brothers and sisters struggled with him in the civil rights movement. So they come to Israel and the pro-Israeli issue in a fundamentally different way. When you combine the vast majority who really don't care but don't need the headache, why would you need the headache? My constituents didn't send me to Washington to do anything other than protect their interests. So I'm not going to, if it's a pro-Israeli letter I'm going to sign, sure I'll sign. Israel's our friend. Congress is not the right place to do this. Congress could provide checks and balances when they're doing their job, but they're never going to become the forum for an honest and clear debate on the Arab-Israeli issue. Divisions within Israel are one of the features of this process that will never change. Since 1948, Israel has had 31 governments. The average length of the governments are 1.8 to 2 years. Now, a lot of that has been reconstituted governments by prime ministers who sought broader legislative majorities. But Kissinger's notion that Israel has no foreign policy, it just has domestic politics, that's an overstatement, clearly. But there's no question. We worked, as Dan recalls, during the Clinton administration, with one Palestinian leader. His name was Yasser Arafat. We worked with Rabin, Peres, Netanyahu, Barak. We worked with 4 Israeli prime ministers during the same period. Domestic politics has a huge pull. And the truth is, Israel is now passing through a historic transition. Its founding generation is gone. Sharon is in a coma, and Shimon Peres is president of the State of Israel. And the younger generation to whom power has been passed, without exaggerating, we already have a body of experience to evaluate their judgment. We have Mr. Netanyahu, we have Mr. Barak, and we have Mr. Olmert. By Israeli standards, don't look to me, failures, every one. 3 of them almost indicted, but 3 of them under domestic scandal, and Olmert may in fact be indicted. So this transition is another complexity without leadership that has moral legitimacy, or at least what I call the legitimacy of six. Look, leaders are empowered in 3 ways. They have historic legitimacy, they have electoral legitimacy, at least in the Middle East, or they have what I call the legitimacy of success. That's how you appear to be a leader. And we don't have that now. You have a woman, Tzipi Livni, who may or may not be the next prime minister, who offers a new look, something different. Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know. But when these deals were done, it was Begin, it was Sadat, it was Rabin, it was even Arafat in his first incarnation. It was King Hussein. The age of heroic politics in Arab-Israeli peacemaking, I'm sorry to say, is over. Oil, what can I say? We've had 4 core interests in the Middle East since the end of the Second World War. Containment of the Soviet Union. I thought it had disappeared, but it's back. Although it's not back with the same sort of virulence that it was between 1945 and 1989. Resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Our commitment to Israel. And access to oil at fair and reasonable prices. In a way, the oil piece of our Middle East policy has always been broken out, and now it's governed primarily by market forces, supply and demand. It's no longer inextricably tied to the Arab-Israeli issue. It is obviously tied to Iran and Iraq. And until the day comes, which will not be anytime soon, where we can, through a consequence of any number of elements, including conservation, more fuel-efficient standards, wind power, solar power, and yes, probably some well-designated drilling, we can achieve a measure of energy independence from hydrocarbons, transportation fuels, which frankly, look, I have to tell you, I'm making a confession. I have 2, I'm a classic case in point. I have 2 SUVs. Why do I do this? Yeah, we have a house in Maine, but I don't drive those SUVs to Maine. Why do I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. You get almost no snow. Why do I have 2 SUVs? I can't answer that question. Why do I drive to work instead of taking the metro? That's a huge part of the problem. And it's part of the investment trap that we're in. And like everything else I've said here today, I'm not sure I see quick or easy solutions.